speaker is Richard Ingram. Richard owns a cheese board where all of the cheeses have personalities of deceased comedians, and he's here tonight with a piece of Sage Derby that has the personality of Harry H. Corbett out of Stepton as well.
Good evening. My talk is in fact about the Tunguska event. There's some controversy about what caused it. It would appear that quite a lot of people seem to have forgotten this event happened. It was 100 years ago. And it was a long time. Technology was less advanced than it is now. People were still using horse-drawn vehicles, no colour photography, radio was just about ticking over. And it was a very remote area of the world. What did happen, though, was there was a huge blast on the 30th of June 1908. It happened in the daytime, and there was a... let's see if I can get this. There we go. There was a trail across the sky, which is just about visible there. Large meteors, when they pass through the air, leave trails behind them, even in the daytime, if they're big enough. I think somewhere in the 50s, there was a small asteroid that came into the top of the atmosphere and carried on through the atmosphere for a while, but fortunately carried on and went out of the atmosphere and went away and left us in peace. It didn't land. But I think there's a piece of film of this. So what happened was the event in Tunguska, which is a remote area. Oops, too far. Where's the signal received?
Okay.
There we go. It's a remote area in Siberia. It's about halfway between Moscow and Tokyo, and it's very much in the middle of nowhere. And what happened, there was a huge explosion, and it knocked down large areas of trees and just flattened the lot, ripped off the branches, in some cases debarked them. And there was an epicenter in the middle where all the trees point away from the middle. Some of the trees that were near to the centre remained upright, but have no branches and no bark, and they're somewhat scorched. Some of this is still there after 100 years. However, the blast was so intense that there was clouds thrown up into the higher atmosphere, possibly a little beyond, that caused light in London, such that you were able to read a newspaper at night. Tunguska is sufficiently far around the world so that when it's daytime there, it's nighttime here. And the blast was also heard for a very long way, for thousands of miles. This is something like 30 miles across. You can see where it is. You see how Siberia is laid out there. You can see where Moscow is, and you can see where Japan is. And it really is in the middle of nowhere. The people who live there are tribal peoples, and this is one of their shaman. This is, of course, a drawing rather than a photograph. They have reports of a tremendous blast of heat. Heat first, well, flash, then heat, then blast. And of trees being blown down around them, trees catching fire. So far as I'm aware, no one was actually killed. There may be some animals killed, and given the number of trees that are down, I suspect the squirrels had a hard time with it. The Tungus people, given the content of the previous talk, also have tales of mythical animals. But in their case, the tales are based on finding their remains around the tundra. They find animals they never see running about, they never hunt. And the reason why they're there is they come out of the permafrost, and they've not seen them running around because in many cases they've been extinct for tens of thousands of years. So they have a strange myth of animals that live underground that you never see, but they occasionally find the remains of. megatons, which is 1,000 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. So it was a very serious blast. Fortunately, it was 16 kilometres up in the air. This was before the First World War and before the Russian Revolution. And because of the intervening events, no one went to this remote place until somewhere around in the 1920s. They didn't find a crater then. This is the crater in Arizona. What happens when a large object impacts with the ground is that it throws up a ring wall and that there's a large depression in the centre. Now, depressions will fill with water sometimes, but the ring wall is characteristic. You'll find them in lots of craters around the Earth. And of course, if you look at the Moon, you'll see what happened during the late heavy bombardment of the previous parts, where both planets were accreting large chunks of matter from the rest of the solar system. Most of ours are weathered away, and with continental drift and recycling of the surface. The Earth doesn't have a very permanent surface, so we don't see so many craters as you would find on a body with a permanent surface. They didn't find a crater on the first expedition. On subsequent expeditions, digging into the sediments, what they did find was little spheres of glass and of magnetite. They're microtektites. Tektites are glaciers which are formed by the high temperatures of an impact explosion. And the impact gets so hot, it not only melts the object itself, but it also melts some of the surrounding geology. And they move across, splatter out from the impact point. In fact, some of the tektites from other parts of the world, the bigger ones, show signs of ablation while they're moving, so the front end melts and moves towards the back as a characteristic shape as a result. However, these tektites were just little spheres, and they contain glaciers. So the thing about Tunguska that people tend to have as a controversy is what it was that did it. There's a suggestion that it was some kind of local cause, some kind of tectonic event. I don't think this one stands up because the remains that are found in the sediments contain amounts of iridium and other trace elements which are not in the same kind of proportion that you find in the upper surface of the Earth. Most of those elements apparently are somewhere in the iron core and they're not accessible. However, in space there's quite a lot of lying around with iridium and other things in it, which are characteristic of astronomical and extraterrestrial objects. So that one's not very likely. There was a suggestion that Mr. Tesla had an experiment that went either spectacularly right or horribly wrong. So far as I'm aware, Mr. Tesla did visit this area. And since the output was something like 20 megatons, this was beyond technology at that time. So far as I'm aware, Mr. Tesla never said sorry or was associated with any of this. No one tried to get him to develop weapons technology from it. So this one doesn't have very much by way of evidence to back it up. Although he did some quite interesting things with his electric machines. There is a suggestion for a terrestrial source of there being a very large amount of methane. And methane could get up into the upper atmosphere since it's lighter than air. It is composed of carbon and hydrogen, but it's only got one carbon, which makes it about half the weight of the normal air molecule. So it could theoretically, if there was enough of it, and under the tundra you will find clathrates, which is a mixed ice of methane and water, which plausibly in the summer, and this was in the summer, could theoretically have come loose. However, to produce the kind of effect you want, you would need what's essentially a fuel-air explosion, which I've got illustrated here. This one's being done on purpose. I suspect they're using something like petrol. And the point of a fuel-air explosion is you can produce a detonation, a directional detonation wave, which is similar in destructive capacity to a nuclear blast. I don't know of anybody using them much. There was talk about them being used in the Gulf some little while ago, but the military don't say an awful lot about them. It's the same kind of explosion, however, as you find in a mining explosion, where methane and air mix, and for some reason or other a spark sets it off. Quite a lot of ratios of air and methane will cause a fairly serious explosion. So this is plausible, except for the extraterrestrial deposits which are relating to this particular period. It's there in the sediments, those glassy spheres, and methane doesn't take anything you can turn into glass. Although I suppose in practice, if you've got a large thing like the methane going up, it could generate enough force to produce a bit of lightning and set it off and direct the blast downwards. But the extraterrestrial remains look like they're fairly conclusive in this case. There's not enough evidence to suggest this was the cause. Ah, yes. There are extraterrestrial explanations, and this is one of them. There was a suggestion that some interstellar craft exploded, and if it was an interstellar craft, would therefore of necessity have some kind of very powerful drive mechanism, and the energies involved could cause a large explosion. This is plausible. If anybody watches Star Trek and you remember they're using antimatter as fuel, which is the sort of thing you probably need, or at least that kind of energy, to get from one star system to another. But the ratios in the glass are the same as the rest of the solar system. There's no sign of materials that have been refined and purified and carefully selected, and they're in the ratio that you find in the local solar system. Each of the stars in the galaxy has what's essentially a fingerprint. They're called Fraunhofer lines. They tell you things about the star, they tell you what sort of temperature that it has in its outer atmosphere, but it also tells you what elements it's got. And I call it a fingerprint because pretty much all of the stars are different. They have similarities because of their type, but their individual spectrums are very characteristic. They will tell you what's in that star, and by extension, what's in the immediate material around the star. So you'd expect a slightly different at least, ratio of trace elements if something comes from another star, because it's made of different kind of material. It should have slightly different trace elements. And we haven't seen any definitely identifiable interstellar craft. And if anything's moving from one star to another, they're not doing it in normal space, because there's a sonic boom set up in the interstellar medium, because it actually has a speed of sound, even though it's a fairly thin plasma. And if you go fast enough, you set up what's essentially a sonic boom, and it gives off lots of radio waves, which the radio telescopes show. And there's not a lot of traffic in our galaxy, the Milky Way. What you have is one object, and it's fairly evidently something ejected from a particular star, and that's it. There's nobody moving around at high speeds in the galaxy in normal space by normal means. This doesn't cut out some star drives that pop you through wormholes and things, but we don't know how to do it. Oh, there was one possibility that the UFO was here, didn't explode, but in fact used its weapons to protect us from an incoming asteroid and blew the thing away. It's plausible, but there's no evidence for it. There is a possibility suggested that it might have been a black hole, and this is the entry point of a black hole, a small black hole, not a sun-sized one, coming into our solar system. But you'd also expect a similar event as it comes out again. They're fairly violent objects at the best of times, assuming they exist at all. The big ones are certainly violent anyway. And you'd have an entry and an exit, and there's no sign of an exit, and there's no evidence to back that one either. And there's antimatter. Suggestion that some antimatter came into the atmosphere, and at some point coming in, mixed sufficiently to cause a large detonation. antimatter came into the atmosphere, it's plausible that it would undergo antimatter annihilation. Matter and antimatter destroy each other completely, leaving gamma rays and lots of heat. And the process is tremendously violent, and if there were any around, this would be plausible too. There is, however, no evidence of antimatter within the solar system or in the nearby galaxy, because any interactions with the ordinary matter as it travels about would give out characteristic gamma rays, and you'd be able to detect an object moving around giving out gamma rays all the time. So that one doesn't have any backup for it either. And of course you still have the tektites, the microtectites, and you wouldn't get that from antimatter, I'm afraid. There is the Velikovskian interplanetary thunderbolts from charged comets or asteroids, some kind of boloid. I don't know this can happen. I don't know it produced these kinds of effects. I'm not even sure that if such effects did occur, they would reach the ground. There's a suggestion one of the lakes nearby might be as a result of a mega lightning strike causing a huge fulgurite into the tundra. Fulgurite is a glassy, tree-shaped object that you find in sand dunes sometimes when they've been struck by lightning. As the electricity spreads out through the sand dune, it fuses the glass, fuses the sand into glass. And this produces an interesting kind of glass which is used for jewellery. There is not at this moment any evidence to back that. It's not known if the electromagnetic, well, there is no evidence of electromagnetic effects of this kind, though I'd be surprised if the event itself didn't send out some kind of radio interference. Radio, however, at this point was rather primitive, and no one seems to have noticed anything. There's also a possibility with this kind of electrical discharge that you would have some kind of residual magnetic field. I'm not aware that there's any evidence for this either. Now there's the more natural ones, the boloid, an asteroid or a piece of comet. There we have a fairly characteristic asteroid. It's been battered somewhat. It's basically a great big piece of rock. They're not held together very tightly, but something that size would probably do the same kind of damage as was done to the dinosaurs. It would, however, leave a very large crater. There have, however, been quite a lot of craters and impacts over the years. They're scattered all over the surface of the Earth. Given the weathering, most of these are moderately recent, although I do know one that's something like 500 million years old. The Tunguska event produced a clearing of hundreds of square miles, and this is compared to New York City and to Washington DC. You see, a direct hit would completely wipe them out. A direct hit of this kind would completely wipe them out. Let's see. Comets are quite plausible, since they have a great deal of ice in them, not just water ice, but carbon dioxide and other things of that kind. And when you come into the atmosphere and it starts to heat up, it's plausible that it would rapidly gasify. And the temperature you would get would be essentially translating the velocity of the comet into heat. Because in gases, heat is essentially the velocity of the individual molecules. So if they simply go off in randomised directions, it becomes, in this case, a tremendous amount of heat. Enough to melt glass and iron and other things of this kind. So that's quite plausible. They also have enough bits and pieces of stuff in them, of dust, stones, bits of iron and so forth, to have provided the tektites. Although it is suggested that the amount of, or the ratios of them are more like an asteroid. There's a particular comet which might make a very good candidate. That's a picture of a comet. The core of the comet is sometimes miles across, perhaps 10 miles across, not necessarily regularly shaped. The tail is tremendously long, thousands, hundreds of thousands, in fact sometimes millions of miles long. And I did see one comet where the data we had suggested it was about the same distance from the Earth as the Sun was, and it was about half a degree in diameter. So the cloud of dust and gas around it was about as big as the Sun. But the density of the matter was similar to the density of matter inside a neon tube. It was a kind of thick vacuum. However, since it had the same kinds of, well, had things in it which reacted with the Sun's ultraviolet light, this caused it to light up like a neon tube, and it makes it look like that. I think they're rather pretty, just as long as they don't hit or get in the way. Oh, quite a lot of the comets are associated with meteor showers. They spend time and energy going in close to the Sun, and when they do that, the ices boil off and the dust comes loose, and the pressure of the solar wind and the light from the Sun separates out a lot of the bits of grit. So the next time, or any time, you go past the orbit of this comet, you're liable to get a meteor shower. We had one last weekend called the Perseid meteor shower, which is something like 1 meteor a minute, which is a pretty good one. It's basically little bits of grit left over from when a comet came by. Now, I don't know if any of you recognise this one. What some comets do is they break up. This is Shoemaker-Levy. Shoemaker-Levy was broken up by the tidal forces from going close to Jupiter. It shattered into something like about 23 pieces, and they're about a mile across. And what happened is they went in, one after another, and they went into Jupiter's atmosphere. You can see Jupiter there. You can see the colours aren't very perfect, but that yellow mark there is the red spot. To give it some kind of size perspective, it's a piece of weather that's been seen as long as people have had telescopes to see it, which is about 300 or 400 years, and it's rather larger than the Earth. If that weather forecast said that was coming by, I'd have a little bit of a problem about it. These, however, are the disturbances in the atmosphere of the Shoemaker-Levy too many. Talk to me. Fine. The Shoemaker-Levy pieces. And we can see that comets do break up. We can see that they do interplanetary atmospheres. These went off so that there were huge plumes of gas, hemispheres of gas going up way above the atmosphere. There were serious detonations. But then they were quite big pieces of matter, and they were dropping through Jupiter's gravity well. They did, however, have a certain amount of velocity of their own. Even so, this is a catastrophic event. I have no idea whether there's anything living in the clouds of Jupiter, but they would have had a hard time of it. This one here is Encke's comet. Now, Encke is a comet that's been around in the inner system for quite a long time. It's been going closer and further from the Sun, not really very far away from the Sun, and it's been thoroughly cooked. It doesn't give up a lot of gas and dust as much as the newer comets do when they come in and make huge trails and huge dust clouds. But what has been suggested is that at various times this comet too has broken off fragments, and they're on the same path as the Beta Taurines, which is a meteor shower that comes in from the direction of the Sun. So it's a daytime shower, you don't see them coming. A little bit like these Zero fighters coming out of the Sun when they're doing dogfights and so forth. there are quite a lot of asteroids and other objects of that kind which seem to come from the solar direction. And by definition, if they cross our orbit, they have to cross it going one way or the other, and it's just as likely they come from the sun as from the night side. So you won't see them coming, not in ordinary, well, not easily anyway. You'll need radar and things of this nature, or special probes like the SOHO one, which is put between the Earth and the Sun to observe the Sun. So, one of the comet fragments, well, several of the comet fragments have, at the time when the Meteorites are red, they've been piling into the Moon. And we did have one. They've got seismometers on the Moon, which detect impacts. And it just happens to be at the time when the Meteorites are around. And some of these impacts have been quite substantial. And we've had odd ones on the Earth too. Not very often, but now and then. There's also some satellite information that's been declassified from the American military. It turns out that stuff does enter our atmosphere quite a bit, and there's some fairly large detonations in the upper atmosphere, which don't seem to make, people don't seem to notice very much. But they're up to something like 20 kilotons about once a year. That's an individual blast of about 20 kilotons. This is a little bit alarming because we haven't noticed it happening. And there's stuff much smaller than that down to 1 kiloton. And again, it all explodes up in the upper atmosphere. And luckily, people did a bit of an investigation before they pushed the red button and launched off all the missiles, because it looks an awful lot like a nuclear weapon when it goes off. So I think that the best bet for the cause of the Tunguska event was probably a piece of Encke's comet or some other comet, and it looks like it's a natural, belongs to the solar system, bolide event. And since events of this kind are going on pretty much all the time, it's plausible, and unless there's some better evidence from somewhere, somebody excavates a crater, somebody finds out there is a fulgurite, then I think this is the best explanation, and it has probably something like 90% certainty that it was a piece of the comet or an asteroid. I'll take questions.
Yeah, questions. Okay. Can I have my runner? I'm not saying that Aurelia didn't do a nice job as a runner, but she's not a patch on my bloodsucker.
What's antimatter?
Antimatter is matter which is made up of particles which are the antiparticles of normal matter. The difference between them is that the charge is the opposite charge. So instead of having electrons with a negative charge going around the nucleus, you have positrons with a positive charge going around the nucleus. And in the nucleus, instead of having protons with a positive charge, you have antiprotons with a negative charge. You can make these things in particle accelerators, and there have been quite considerable amounts of antimatter made at one time or another. There is a minor problem of what you put it in, because if it interacts with ordinary matter, it annihilates. There is a thing you put it in, it's a thing called a penning trap, where with the use of electric and magnetic fields, you can stick these charged particles so they stay put and don't touch anything. Oh, and they have particle and antiparticle beams, mostly protons and antiprotons, whirling around in particle accelerators. Then they bash them together to see what happens. This is quite interesting for a particle physicist.
Okay, what's a particle?
Oh. At the bottom end of the matter around you is an atom. This is the building block of the things that you're standing on and the things you're made of. There's about 90 odd natural ones, and they come in different weights. However, these are made up of smaller particles. And unfortunately, you go another level where those particles are made up of smaller particles. If you listen to the particle physicists, they go a few levels more, and they'll have them made out of strings and all sorts of things. But most of the theory for that isn't solid yet.
At the row behind.
I believe that analysis of witnesses to the Tunguska object suggests that the trajectory changed direction to some degree. Is there any astronomical explanation for this?
It's possible that there could have been some kind of early interaction on the surface, an explosion of some kind, which is plausible. The alien spacecraft is also plausible, as they change direction. It doesn't look like it would make any difference if it changed direction. There's nothing much out there except tundra, and one bit of tundra to blow up over is much like another bit of tundra to blow up over. So it's possible some kind of explosion on the surface or early detonation could have done this. I am not sure that this change of direction took place. None of the diagrams I've seen show this.
Any other questions? Right there at the back.
I'm curious to know if it was measured on the Richter scale, because at that time they were taking measurements, I presume?
Unfortunately, the Richter scale dates from about this period. So the Richter scale wasn't properly calibrated at the time. I believe there were some measurements, but there's a little bit of doubt about the intensity of them. Though the shockwave in the air did go around the world twice.
Yeah. So if there were measurements taken, I'm just curious to know how that would happen if it exploded at approximately 16 kilometres above the Earth's surface.
Well, the immediate shockwave would, of course, reach the ground, which is, after all, while the trees are dead.
Yeah. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay, microphone runner, we're about to open.
Thank you.
No more questions? My eyes are very dim tonight, so if there's somebody at the back waving their hand back in the air and I haven't seen you, I do apologise. Richard has been a friend of mine for, oh God, 15 years, 20 years, something like that. We've known each other a long time. And he originally was just coming up because he's a friend of mine, he always comes to the weekend. Those of you who saw an earlier version of the programme this weekend will notice that a couple of people are no longer on the programme because Paul Vella had to pull out nearly at the last moment because of a family problem, and Lee Walker sent me a very distraught message yesterday that he's having big personal difficulties at the moment and he couldn't come down. I thought, bloody hell, what am I going to do? Because the thing is, Paul Vella was my ace in the hole. He was my person who was going to give a second talk if necessary. And I suddenly lost him. And then I looked out at my office window and I saw Richard happily walking across my lawn and having a long conversation with my wife's pet jackdaw. And I thought, aha, I know he's going to give the talk. He has had less than 24 hours to prepare it. As always, it's a joy, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Richard Ingram. Nicola, come in here and sell things there. If anybody hasn't got raffle tickets, then they have Nicola to answer to it. She's a very, very scary lady. So we have raffle tickets for sale. Don't go off to the bar because in a very few moments' time we have the scary zone. Hang on, we've got reverb. Can you put reverb on my mic for a second? We have, let's see this, the scary zone. That's quite good. Just going to try an experiment. David, is the reverb on both mics, right? On one? One. Yeah, because in a few moments we're going to have the scary zone. Is there anybody, apart from my last speaker, who wants to buy a raffle ticket? Because Nicola will be very nasty to you if you don't. Another thing is, as I'm sure most of you are aware, Sunday night we have dinner at the Farmer's Arms, the pub in the village. We want to give approximate numbers to Jenny. She knows how many she's cooking for. So could you, before the end of the evening, if you are interested, you'll have another chance tomorrow, but could you go up and see my wife on the It is roast lamb, or the vegetarian option is something baked, some sort of baked with things in it. And I can't for the life of me remember what it is.
Turnip, a raw turnip.
Yes, according to Richard, it's raw turnip, but I very, very much doubt it. Okay, if you... Rick, I tell you what, Dave, you put a piece of music on just for a couple of minutes while we finish setting up.